Welcome to the fifth presentation in the series where we're looking at the book of Deuteronomy. Let's look back at some of the findings in the previous presentation. The book of Deuteronomy, it is a book of direction for quality living, set in a particular historical context but illustrating eternal principles. We looked at the 10 Commandments in the last presentation, often described as 10 words, 10 communications from God. It's a set of principles, and they need to be interpreted into every social context. Applying these releases human potential, positive living, living at its best. They're not restrictive. But there's deep thought here. They only carry their full meaning in the context of God acting in grace. He released these people from slavery. In Jesus, He releases us from all the bondage in our lives today. Then the commandments have meaning. They're not designed as a set of rules which we keep to impress God. That's not the context. That's not their significance. We saw there was a pattern in these 10 words. The first 4 focus on God-human relationships. The final 5 focus on human relationships. But the one in the middle, it relates to the fact that it's a covenant community, a whole people group responding to God. And it applies both ways, relationships with God or relationships among humans. And it's a simple truth that evidence shows is soundly founded. The bedrock of community life relies on sound family relationships, and a covenant community life, it's essential that there are sound family relationships, something that tragically we're losing rapidly in the West today. This people group facing a task to take over a land, to provide for them a secure base that they could reach out to bless others, fulfilling the promise made to Abraham. In the land they will meet and confront all kinds of religions and social practices, some of them just simply horrendous by any standards. The temptation is to compromise. And these 10 commandments, 10 words, they set a completely different agenda, a completely different lifestyle, stands in complete stark contrast to the kind of lifestyle that was in the land. But the people group were given the land for a purpose. They had a destiny, making God known to the world, to the people group who were in the land, around the land, and wider throughout the world. Deuteronomy, Moses is setting out the principles which are going to help them as they face this task, this daunting task. The principles apply at all times in all circumstances, and Moses in interpreting them and explaining them in the context of what they were about to face. They needed to be equipped, warned, forewarned, so that they could face what lay ahead. The end goal, the people group known as Israel, the very lifestyle and behavior was to reflect the nature and character of God, so that they could make an impact on those around. That was God's purpose, to bless other people. Central to all of this was that simple command: loving God with every fibre of our being. Interesting, the central command doesn't relate to obedience, but to love, involving every part of our being. And when we put God first that way, within us there becomes a desire and a commitment to live our lives His way. And we saw the contrast between the Bible sequence of thought, Everything starts with God's grace. God does for us what we can't do for ourselves. In this case, the people group were released from slavery. They had no chance of getting out of slavery on their own. God seeks a response. That's love. And when we put God at the center, desire and commitment to obey, they develop. In the Quran, it's exactly reversed. Read the Quran, everything is, here are the rules, obey them. Don't question them, do it. That may lead to you loving God. It may lead to God loving you, if you keep enough of them. Described as God maybe being able to show his grace towards us. An exact reversal of the thought form. And that very often is the way of religion. The Bible is different. Now let's move forward into the theme of this presentation. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is one of the most difficult chapters in the entire Bible. Is God commanding ethnic cleansing? Is God commanding that a people group should just be destroyed, or many people groups? How do holiness and violence fit together? Or do they? And how do we face up to the idea that this people group called Israel seemed to be chosen? Major problems. And faced with these major problems, there are two common human reactions. And that's what we're doing in our Christian communities. I can never remember hearing any presentation on this chapter. I've called that a cop-out. We've got to face the issues, and this is why. People look at this chapter and say religion in general and Christianity in particular encourages violence. So they reject Christianity. We've got to face up to these issues and try and seek solutions to them. I'm going to try this by looking at it at three levels. I'm going to read the chapter overall just to give the overall impression. It's important to see the context. Then we'll look at it section by section to pick out a few points, sometimes clear points, sometimes difficult points. And then we'll come at the end to look at the problems that arise in this chapter and to see what we can make of them. We're looking for evidence, not opinion, not a cop-out, not a walk away from. I'm not trying to explain things away by naive argument. We're looking for evidence. Come with me and let's see if we can go through this. Chapter 7 overall. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you are to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, burn their idols in the fire, religious artifacts. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commands. But those who hate him he will repay to their face by destruction. He will not be slow to repay to their face, those who hate him. Therefore take care to follow the commands, decrees, and laws I give you today. Moving on. If you pay attention to these laws and are careful to follow them, then the Lord your God will keep his covenant of love with you, as he swore to your ancestors. He will love you and bless you and increase your numbers. He will bless the fruit of your womb, the crops of your land, your corn, new wine and oil, the calves of your herds and the lambs of your flocks, in the land that he swore to your ancestors to give you. You'll be blessed more than any other people. None of your men or women will be childless, nor any of your livestock without young. The Lord will keep you free from every disease. He will not inflict on you the horrible disease you knew in Egypt, but will inflict on all who hate you. You must destroy all the peoples the Lord your God gives over to you. Do not look on them with pity, and do not serve their gods, for that will be a snare to you. You may say to yourselves, these nations are stronger than we are. How can we drive them out? But do not be afraid of them. Remember well what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. You saw with your own eyes the great trials, the signs, the wonders, the mighty hand and outstretched arm with which the Lord your God brought you out. The Lord your God will do the same to all the peoples you now fear. Moreover, the Lord your God will send a hornet among them, till even the survivors who hide from you have perished. Do not be terrified by them, for the Lord your God who is among you is a great and awesome God. The Lord your God will drive out these nations before you, little by little. You will not be allowed to eliminate them all at once, or the wild animals will multiply around you. But the Lord your God will deliver them over to you, throwing them into great confusion till they are destroyed. He will give their kings into your hand, and you will wipe out their names from under heaven. No one will be able to stand against you. You will destroy them. The images of their gods you are to burn in the fire. Do not cover the silver and gold in them. Do not take it for yourselves, or you'll be ensnared by it, for it is detestable to the Lord your God. Do not bring a detestable thing into your house, or you like it will be set apart for destruction. Regard it as vile and utterly defeated, for it is set apart for destruction. Pretty blunt. Let's take it now section by section. The first 6 verses. You're entering to possess and drives out before you many nations. In the original, entering there to tenant land, and he eases out people groups. Tenant land. They were given the land for a purpose, and if they failed to fulfill that purpose, they would lose it, and lose it forever. Easing out people groups, what actually happened was he eased out their control. He didn't wipe them out. Whole bundle of people groups there. Probably that's the origin. In some cases we're very sure of it, other cases we're not so sure. All these people groups had migrated into the land in the previous century or two. They were also tenants in the land. Now if you look at the evidence, mostly archaeological, but also there's some literary evidence, there were scattered communities and they'd immigrated into the area in the past, sometimes many hundreds of years before. There were small fortresses. The fortresses were also kind of caravan centres where people could get a bed overnight and refresh themselves. They guarded the trade routes, because the land was strategically placed and there were trade routes that came from the north, coming from Asia and indeed all the way across into Europe, and travelling south into Africa. It had been ruled by the Hittite or Egyptian Empire intermittently. At that time the Egyptians were ruling it, but they didn't pay any attention to it, so rule was hardly any sort of organisation. The religions that had evolved in the land area tended to worship fertility. Fertility of the land. They were gods of fertility. That very quickly went to human fertility, which then ended up with the abuse of sex. So your temple prostitution, and eventually the product of fertility, child sacrifice. Not a good picture. But that bit's fairly blunt. We'll look at some of the words there and their meanings. But it's interesting to observe, as we saw in the presentation 2, where we looked at this very briefly, destroying them totally is described in terms of smashing up their religious system, not slaughtering the people, because if you slaughter the people, intermarriage doesn't enter into the agenda. Intermarriage, in fact, biblically is not wrong. The intermarriage was wrong when it meant a compromise with the religion that was being brought in, which brought in its own evils. We'll return to some of these words in a minute. You can summarize this. Make no covenant with them. There was to be no compromise. No graciousness. You see, tolerance can end up leading to compromise. You don't have tolerance towards blatant evil that hurts people and murders infants. The intermarriage, wrong when it brought in false religion, which brought in corruption. Things to be done, destroy them totally. We looked at that word briefly before in presentation 2. We're going to look at it again later on. That's what destroying them totally in this context here meant. But why one people group? Is that fair? The next bundle of verses. Notice again the key words we've seen again and again consistently used in this book. God's commands, His directions, the boundary conditions that we all need for happy living. And that all issues out in how we treat each other. But we've got to ask that question. God's choice of this people, how does that relate to keeping commands? What religion always does is, do what God says, God will be pleased with you, maybe show you His grace and favour. That's exactly the opposite of what this chapter is saying, because it keeps stressing what God did first, rescuing them from slavery, taking them through the desert, which is utterly barren, providing for them. Let's move to the next stretch. Paying attention to these laws, the word there is the word that refers to social justice, how we treat other people. The evidence that we are walking the ways of God and that we're authentic in our relationship with God is seen in how we treat other people, all other people, not just those in our own group, but in wider society. Absolutely central, and we've got to recapture that in our Christian groups today. We will make no impact till we put that right. So I summarize it that way. Western society will pay no attention to Christian groups until they see evidence in how we treat other people. If we stand on the sidelines and hurl criticisms at them, we're just seen as bigots. There's the practicalities. And there are wonderful, wonderful things being done in Christian groups today where people are helping others in need in wider society. But it's so often undermined by so much that's just a religious performance. What about the promises here? Perfect fertility, no illnesses, and a life of agricultural luxury? And how does that square with the command to destroy all other people groups? Well, first of all, as we've seen already, the destruction of all other people groups is not quite what it would appear to be. They were allowed this land as tenants for the purpose of bringing blessing to people groups there and around, so that God could be made known to the wider world. And as long as they had that agenda central, God would provide for them. He would provide for them in terms of descendants, health, and enough food and water to live. It's not a willy-nilly promise of anything. Now the final stretch here, pretty blunt. I'm going to just to summarize some of the thoughts in this. The key to success is that recognizing that God wins the battles. Our strategic planning, our skills and abilities are not the central issue. This people group had none of them. They were second or third generation slaves. Now, whatever gifts they had to devote fully to God's service. But that's not the central thing. So often in our Christian groups today, we spend time in our committees and groups planning, strategizing, setting up all sorts of statements. Let's get God back in the center and ask Him what He wants us to do and what resources He wants to give us to do it. Because God does know the best strategy. God knows us infinitely better than we know ourselves. And God understands the opposition. In that context, God will provide all the necessary resources, in this case, so that this people group could live reflecting the nature and character of God before the world around. God would provide all the resources to that end. Not just so that they could have a cushy number and a cushy life. There's a purpose in it all. Chosenness is always for a purpose. But if we're going to do it God's way, we've got to do it God's way. And we've got to stop taking decisions in our Christian gatherings and leadership groups and then praying and asking God to rubber stamp it. And we've got to put right relationships within our groups and with the wider societies. But it leaves that question. And this is where religious critics will come at us again and again. How can a God of love mandate the destruction and elimination of other people? And if you rip verses out of context and ignore the meaning of the original words, often depending on an old version of the Bible, where the words are often very misleading. Modern ones are so much better. Then it's quite easy to demolish and undermine any concept of a God of love. We've got to have an answer to that, and we've got to think this through, and this presentation will only just start the thinking process. We're going to have to work it through a lot further. Now let's look at some of the big problems. I put down three major problems. There are others, but I put down three. These are the three that seem to me to stand out, put the biggest problems in this passage. Does God ever command violence? Why should God choose one people group? And too often today we have seen our little church group as the in group. God's chosen people, we're going to sort out the world. No, we're not. We're not going to do that. God does the choosing and God does the equipping. But is it all unfair? If we don't happen to be the in group? And a lot of very damaging theologies come up built around this word election, which is just a fancy word meaning chosen group. And is it not just a picture of do what God says, be obedient absolutely in every detail, and God will be pleased and he'll reward you. And at the end of it he'll reward you with heaven. Is that the picture here? That's the picture that's implicit in all other religions and is very overtly specific in Islam. Is it fair? Some of us are born into circumstances which makes it easier to do good things. Other of us, through no fault of our own, are born into circumstances where we're almost trained by our context and our culture for things that are wrong. Unfair. Now I'm going to give pointers to the answers. It won't answer everything. Don't criticize, take them as pointers. You've got to work it through and go further. We've got to remember the context. This book is a record of what Moses did, where he was explaining and teaching and preparing the people for what faced them as they entered the land. That's the context. Instructions about the forthcoming campaign. The original language is important. And here, older versions of the Bible can often do immense damage. But we've got to recognize that. Translators of the modern versions tried their best. It's not easy. But that's the real question. What was Moses intending to communicate? Words are vehicles of meaning. And we're going to use that and look at that in a moment or two. Now Moses was seeking to communicate what God was directing him to say. That's the claim of the book. And the evidence from events of history suggests that that is no false claim. Let's look at the concept of chosenness at the beginning. God did not choose them because they were special in any way. That's made very clear in the chapter. And there's no mention of being chosen for heaven. There never is. Indeed, throughout the Old Testament, there are no clear words that define heaven or hell in the way we understand it today. And maybe the way we understand it today is not quite the right way anyway. Indeed, there is no word in the Hebrew language for hell. The word that's often translated hell means the shadowy place of the dead, which is neither heaven nor hell. But God did choose them because they were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of whom listened to God and responded positively. That's not to say they were perfect, they weren't. But they listened and they responded positively. And God chose them for a task, and He always does. He never chooses us for some reward or destiny. He chooses us for a task, and the task is always to bring benefit to others. And what God looks for is a positive response in this people group. And what God looks for us today in our Christian communities is a positive response for whatever task He has for us to fulfill. If you track through the words for choose right throughout the whole Bible, it is always for specific tasks. And the tasks, directly or indirectly, bring benefit to others. And it goes right back to what God said to Abraham, right back to Genesis 12. Look at the last two lines. And all peoples, that's people groups on earth, will be blessed through you. And a very distant descendant of Abraham was Jesus. And just think of the positive benefits Jesus brought and is bringing to people groups over the entire planet today. The land itself, that's roughly in the buff shading there, the land that they took. Abram had moved south to land in response to God's direction centuries before. When he got there, God promised the land to the descendants of Abraham. The land was pretty empty then, and it wasn't very full in the days when Moses was around. It's strategically placed because it's the bridge between Africa, Asia and Europe. Ruled by these two empires, one to the north, one to the south. Small communities, a few fortresses usually guarding trade routes. Sparsely inhabited. Various people groups had migrated there because of the land's fertility. But here was a secure location. God could reach out to wider humanity through the descendants of Abraham. That was God's plan and purpose. Now the nation of Israel failed, and you only have to look at the great prophetic books, just specifically Isaiah and Jeremiah, for example, to see their abject failure. But they also succeeded, because from that people group Jesus was born to transform the world, if we will let him. Ethnic cleansing. Now I've just picked up the verses here that have got words or phrases or bits and pieces that really jar on us when we read them in English. I'm going to highlight and colour the words in a variety of colours, and you'll see why in a moment. Because it's the same word when the same colour is used in the original language. You can't tell from the English. Words that are in green, right at the top and at the bottom of the table. That word is harem, devoted. Everything belongs to the Lord. Impossible to translate in a simple way. And footnotes in modern Bibles note that in difficulty in translation. In the context of war, everything, including all the spoil, was God's, for God brought the victory. None of the lifestyle of the people that are defeated may be absorbed, while the artifacts, their religious artifacts, had to be destroyed, and the wealth artifacts had to be destroyed to prevent human misappropriation. Now that captures some of the meaning of that word, and it has a very limited usage in the Old Testament. Look at the words in blue, 3 times there. The word here destroyed is destroyed in the sense of overthrown. You could see their power base has been brought down. That's not necessarily people being murdered and killed. Excellent translation. Smashing them up. Now the word is most frequently used of eating or consuming food, and it's applied metaphorically here to indicate the local groups were absorbed or taken over, not destroying them in the sense of killing them. In red, eliminate. It's a common word, slightly misleading translated as eliminate, but you can see why translators have used it. The word essentially relates to a task that has been completed, something that's come to an end. In other words, it's not going to all happen at once. It'll take time. In the dark orange, the word destruction, destroyed, perished, wiped out, it's in the sense of something undone. And it's used in the sense of activities that come to nothing. Again, nothing to do with killing people. Throwing them into great confusion, it's the same word used as a verb and a noun, which is a Hebrew way to stress something, which is why it's been great confusion. It's destroyed in the sense of discomfiture, and the translation there captures that meaning very well. So we got to watch the words. This group were facing the way ahead. They were the descendants of a rabble of slaves who had been rescued from Egypt. God had promised them a secure homeland. He would enable them to move into that secure homeland. In the homeland there were scattered communities and a few fortresses guarding trade routes. There were very harmful culture and religious practices that hurt people, indeed sometimes killed people, and certainly brought a lot of disease. Don't compromise with them, have nothing to do with them. You see, God wanted them to enjoy a lifestyle that reflected His nature, and the 10 Commands, the 10 words, give you the framework for that lifestyle, and that's worked out in detail in practicalities in the context of entering the land as we go read through the book. But that's why He gave them the land. He set the kind of lifestyle He wanted, because that lifestyle would make a positive impact. And you can always see that happening. History shows that. Go to the days of Jesus and just after that. Jewish people, godly Jewish people, had scattered throughout the Roman Empire for various reasons. They took with them their religion and the way they treated marriage, child rearing, relationships. It created an impact on the society where they'd settled. And they were known as God-fearers. People came in because they wanted this. It gave them a better quality of living. And so around these little local synagogues there were gathered all sorts of local people, the God-fearers, who were trying and were attracted to this positive lifestyle. Now that happened in the days of Jesus. And you can see it in the way when Paul moved around. It didn't always happen. Sometimes they took the religion out with them and they just reduced it to rituals and rules. And Paul had to confront that. So there is a choice for us. In the light of all of that, what Moses is communicating is, go for the courage. The task looks impossible. You don't know the way of the land. You don't know your way around. Not a huge number. You're not armed. You don't have equipment. God's with you. Go forward. They had to wipe out the fortresses. And you can see the remarkable way that Jericho, which if you look at the archaeological remains today, is a very small fortress. It's not a city or a great group. But look at the way it was wiped out. They couldn't attack it. They couldn't conquer it. They walked round it. God brought it down. Subdue the population. Take control of it. Treat them with respect. But don't compromise. And specifically don't compromise in any areas of ethics, morality or religious practices, because the quality lifestyle will just be undermined and disintegrate. And tragically that's what's happening in the West today. Ethnic cleansing, it's impossible when you look at the language used. and the meaning of the words, it's impossible to argue this is ethnic cleansing. It's simply not what the chapter says. There are two central concepts in the chapter: election and choice. God chose this people for a task that they were to undertake. Most of the time they failed, but it was succeeded, the task, in the life of Jesus. They're described as a people holy, set apart. And that's because they were to have quality living. This is nothing to do with religious piety. It's quality living. If you like, in modern language, living the Jesus way before the watching world. Because you see, when we do that, it makes a positive impact. It always does. But it's not to be synthetic. It has to be real, empowered by God the Holy Spirit. We've got to respond. We've got to open ourselves up to God. We've got to put Him first in our agenda. And then we'll want to do it His way. God's the top priority for our living. We glorify God by how we live and how we treat others. That's how God's glory is seen. And you can see hints of that all over the latter chapters, the prophecy of Isaiah. And God will provide for us everything we need to fulfill this destiny. And that's the picture that's been given here. It's not promises we can rip out of context. It's when we're trying to fulfill what God has for us, for you and me to do. God will provide everything we need for that. But watch the compromise. It's too easy for tolerance to lead to compromise. And that will undermine all that God has for us to do. That's the thrust of the chapter. And that is perhaps a key sentence in the chapter. A people holy to the Lord your God. Oh, the word holy carries all sorts of unfortunate baggage in our modern thinking. It means we're living the Jesus way before the watching world. Key words and phrases: people holy to the Lord, and destroy or devote totally. Could come into English as herem or herem. That's the thrust of that word. Totally set apart for God for His purposes and service. It's not a word that implies mass killing. That's God's goal. But He's going to do that through individuals and groups, the yous and me's, if we follow His ways. This time in history, it was through a people group known as the Israelites. Now that's going to work. That people group had to live a lifestyle that reflected the nature of God. They had to live the Jesus way, if you like, in modern language. That brings God's glory. That's central. And that principle is unaltered today. But we've got to watch this. That's not easy. We've got to ask for God's wisdom, strength, guidance and courage. That means for this people group entering this land at this time in history, they had to dismantle all that would undermine God's standards. And the religious structures that were there would certainly undermine God's standards. They had to go. And they didn't always obey that command. Now, if we do not reflect the life quality of Jesus, positive impact will not occur. And that is the challenge to the church in the West today. We've got to get back to that. And it means we've got to admit we've got things wrong. We're presenting the wrong image. Then we've got to take steps to put it right, following his guidance and his enabling. Chapter 7 overall, there's a sequence of thought in it. Instructions about the forthcoming campaign. Yes, it illustrates and demonstrates underlying principles. They apply universally, but we mustn't rip things out of context. God's going to give the land, but the people had to go and take it. Fundamental principle. They're only tenants, and they're only going to hold the land as long as they pursue the destiny God seeks for them. They lost it. AD 70. They lost it for good. Notwithstanding what's happening today in the Middle East. They lost the land as rightful tenants, as God's people. And that's what God wanted to happen. It happened in part, not completely. Intermarriage is not in itself wrong, but intermarriage when it brings in the religious practices which are anti-God and anti-Jesus, that's wrong. Deuteronomy 7. Back to our 3 central questions. God does not command any wipeout, as a look at the actual words that are used makes very clear. But God does warn against compromise, because he's looking for quality lifestyle so that the people could fulfill their destiny, the purposes God had for them. God doesn't choose people because he likes them, his favorites. He will choose any one of his followers, all of us, for tasks to be completed. It's not a reward. And the land was only given for that purpose, and that purpose was fulfilled in Jesus. And obedience isn't a question of winning God's favour, our meal ticket to heaven. It always starts with grace. God doing for us what we can't do for ourselves. In this case, rescuing them from slavery and preserving them through their desert travels. But he seeks that, because that allows us security and the fulfilled living that he wants for us. Because his framework, his directions, is the best way for all humanity. It's been a gallop through a very, very difficult chapter. Go and study it further and read further. Think it through, discuss it through, and see what God is saying to you in this particular chapter. People were facing a daunting task. They were about to enter the land, a land that was given to them as tenants for a purpose. Moses is outlining and interpreting the principles of God so that they can fulfill that purpose, carrying it forward. That's what chapter 7 is all about. We move on in the next presentation to look at the reality that many of them forgot, and they rebelled against God's purposes and ways, tragically.